I want you to know that I remember everything, every single detail. The color of her jacket, the way the rain sounded on the roof that night, the smell of coffee in the interrogation room 17 years ago when I lied to your face. I remember all of it. And I need you to understand something before we start. I didn't forget. I never forgot. I chose silence. And now I'm choosing to speak. But not because I want forgiveness. I gave up on that a long time ago. Those were the first words Thomas Calloway spoke when he requested the meeting. After 17 years of silence, of denial, of walking free while families buried their questions along with their dead. The detective who took the call didn't recognize the name at first. It had been filed away, archived, boxed up with hundreds of other cold cases that sit in basement storage rooms, collecting dust and despair. But when he pulled the file, when he saw the photographs, the timeline, the notes scribbled in margins by investigators long retired or dead, he felt something cold settle in his stomach. Thomas Calloway, age 49 now. He would have been 32 then. The last person to see Rachel Denning alive, according to witness statements, questioned extensively, released due to lack of evidence, never charged, never arrested, just another name in a file that eventually got buried under newer tragedies, fresher nightmares. The meeting was arranged in a small room at the county prosecutor's office, not an interrogation room, technically. Thomas wasn't under arrest. He had come voluntarily, walked in through the front door on a Tuesday morning in October when the leaves were just starting to turn, and there was that particular quality of light that makes everything look like a memory already. He was wearing a grey sweater, jeans, regular shoes. He looked like anyone, like someone's father, someone's neighbor, someone you'd stand next to in line at the grocery store without a second thought. That's what got people, later, when the news broke, how ordinary he looked. Detective Sarah Chen was the one who sat across from him. She was 28 years old, hadn't even been on the force when Rachel Denning disappeared. She'd read the file 3 times the night before, sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee and a growing sense of dread. Now she sat with her hands folded on the table between them, recorder running, and waited. Thomas looked at the recorder for a long moment. Then he smiled, just slightly, and it wasn't a cruel smile or a proud one. It was tired, deeply, existentially tired. "You're wondering why now," he said. His voice was quiet, measured. "Everyone's going to wonder that. Why 17 years? Why not 16? Why not never? I've been asking myself the same thing for months, maybe years, if I'm honest. And I think the answer is simple and complicated at the same time. I'm dying. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8, if I'm unlucky. And I realized that I was going to die with this, that it was going to die with me, and that felt wrong. Not morally wrong. I gave up on morality a long time ago. But wrong in the way that a story left unfinished is wrong. Wrong in the way that a question without an answer is wrong." He paused, looking at something past Detective Chun's shoulder. The window, maybe, though the blinds were closed. Or maybe nothing at all. "So here I am, and I'm going to tell you everything. But I need you to understand that I'm not asking for anything. I'm not asking for a deal. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm not asking for understanding. I'm just asking that you listen all the way through, because if you interrupt me, if you stop me, I might lose the thread of it, and I need to tell it the way it happened, not the way you want it to have happened, not the way that makes sense for a courtroom, the way it actually was." Detective Chen nodded once. Her throat was dry, but she didn't reach for her water. She was afraid that any movement might break whatever fragile thing was happening here. "Okay," she said softly. "I'm listening." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, he seemed to be looking at something very far away. "Rachel Denning was not the first," he said, and the room became very small and very cold, and the October light outside seemed like something from another world entirely. The file on Rachel Denning was 3 inches thick. Missing person, presumed dead. Case went cold after 18 months of intensive investigation. Last seen leaving the library where she worked as an assistant on a Thursday evening in March 17 years ago. She was 24 years old, graduate student in psychology, engaged to be married that summer, walked to her car in the parking lot around 8:15 p.m. Her car was found the next morning in the same spot. Keys on the ground next to the driver's side door, purse inside, wallet intact, phone dead on the passenger seat. No signs of struggle in the parking lot. No surveillance cameras in that area of the campus. 3 witnesses saw her walking to her car. No one saw her after that, like she had simply evaporated into the spring air. Thomas Calloway had been a person of interest because he had been at the library that night. He'd checked out 2 books on architectural history at 7:45 p.m. The librarian remembered him because he'd asked about a specific edition, had been very polite, very forgettable. He'd been working as a freelance consultant then, something to do with urban planning and restoration projects. Lived alone in a rental house on the east side of town. No criminal record, no red flags. He'd cooperated fully with the investigation, answered every question, took a polygraph, passed. Let them search his house, his car, his office. They found nothing, absolutely nothing. And after 3 months of dead ends and public pressure and media attention that eventually faded to other tragedies, Thomas Calloway was cleared and the investigation moved on. But Detective Chen knew, as she sat across from him now, that the investigators at the time had never been satisfied with his alibis. There were notes in the margins of the file, question marks next to timeline entries, a post-it note stuck to one of the interview transcripts that just said to calm, but there had been nothing concrete, nothing to hold him on, and eventually he had faded back into his ordinary life, while Rachel Denning remained missing and her family remained broken. Her name was Claire, Thomas said, and his voice had taken on a different quality now, distant narrative, like he was reading from a script only he could see. Claire Hutchison. I was 26. She was 23. This was 6 years before Rachel. You won't find her in any of your files connected to me because I was never a suspect. They never even questioned me. I was just a stranger who happened to be in the wrong place. Or the right place, depending on your perspective. He shifted in his chair, and Detective Chen noticed for the first time how thin he was under that sweater. The cancer was eating him from the inside already. It was winter, January, I think, late January. I was living in Columbus then, working for an architecture firm, junior position, nothing special. Claire was a waitress at a restaurant I went to sometimes, one of those places that tries to be upscale, but isn't quite. She was nice to me, not flirting, just nice in the way that good servers are nice because it's their job, and because maybe they're genuinely kind people. I never asked her out, never even had a real conversation with her, beyond ordering food, but I noticed her, the way you notice things without meaning to. His hands were flat on the table now, palms down, fingers spread slightly, clean fingernails, no wedding ring, no jewelry at all. She disappeared on a Tuesday night. I know because I read about it in the paper 3 days later. Found dead 6 weeks after that, in a wooded area outside the city. Strangled, sexually assaulted. They arrested someone eventually, a guy with a record who'd been spotted in the area. He went to prison. He's probably still there. He didn't do it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Detective Chen felt her pulse in her throat, but kept her face neutral. I did it, Thomas said, and his voice didn't change at all. I followed her home from work that night. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, not planning, exactly, just thinking, imagining, and then one night, I just did it. I waited until she went inside her apartment, and then I knocked on the door, and when she opened it, I pushed my way in. It was easy, terrifyingly easy. That's what I remember most from that first time. How easy it was, how fragile everything is, how thin the line is between a normal Tuesday night and something that can never be undone. He stopped, and there was silence in the room that seemed to expand and fill every corner. I'm not going to describe what I did to her, not because I'm protecting myself, or because I think it's too horrible to say out loud, but because those details belong to her, not to me, and I've taken enough. But I want you to know that it was terrible, and I want you to know that when it was over, when she was dead, I sat in her apartment for almost an hour, just looking at what I'd done, not panicking, not crying, just looking, and I felt nothing, absolutely nothing. And that's when I knew I was going to do it again. Detective Chen's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the recorder, checking that it was still running. The red light blinked steadily. Everything was being captured. Every word, every pause, every moment of this confession that was unfolding like a terrible flower, petal by petal. The investigation was sloppy, Thomas continued, his eyes still focused on that distant point beyond the room. Or maybe it wasn't sloppy. Maybe I was just lucky. They found DNA evidence, but forensic science wasn't what it is now. They had a suspect who fit the profile, who had means and opportunity, who couldn't account for his time that night. And when you have someone who looks guilty and acts guilty, it's easy to stop looking. That's what I learned. People want answers. They want closure. They don't necessarily want the truth, if the truth is too complicated or too frightening. He shifted again, wincing slightly. The pain, Detective Chen realized, was constant now. He was probably on medication just to sit here and talk. I left Columbus 4 months later, took a job in Cincinnati. Not because I was running. I wasn't running. I was just moving, the way people move. And I told myself that Claire had been an aberration, a moment of darkness that I'd passed through and come out the other side of. I told myself I was different now, that I understood what I was capable of, and therefore I could control it. A small, bitter sound that might have been a laugh. I believed that for almost 3 years. 3 years of being normal, of going to work and going home and dating occasionally and having friends and living a life that looked, from the outside, completely unremarkable. And I started to think that maybe I had been right. Maybe it had been a one-time thing, a glitch, an anomaly. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. Do you know what the worst part is? Not the guilt, though there is guilt, or there's something like it. Not the fear of being caught, though that was there too, especially in the beginning. The worst part is how normal you feel after, how quickly you adjust, how easily you slip back into the pattern of ordinary life. You'd think that killing someone would fundamentally change you, would mark you somehow, would make it impossible to function in regular society. But it doesn't. You still get hungry, you still sleep, you still laugh at jokes, and pay your bills and worry about traffic. The horror is how little it changes you. Detective Chen found her voice. When did you know you were going to do it again? Thomas looked at her directly for the first time in several minutes. His eyes were grey, unremarkable. Eyes you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him. I didn't know, he said, not consciously, but looking back, I can see the pattern. The way I started noticing women again, not in a normal way, in that other way, the way I'd noticed Claire. I started taking longer routes home from work, driving through neighborhoods I had no reason to be in, sitting in coffee shops and watching people. It was like there was this current running underneath my regular life, invisible to everyone, including myself, and it was pulling me somewhere. He folded his hands together, the fingers interlacing. Her name was Jessica Moreno. She was 27, worked at a non-profit that did something with environmental advocacy. I met her at a community meeting about a development project. She spoke passionately about preserving green spaces. She had this energy, this conviction, and I remember sitting there, listening to her, and thinking how alive she was, how present, and then thinking how temporary that presence was, how fragile. The room felt smaller now, the air harder to breathe. It was different with Jessica. I didn't follow her randomly. I planned it, not obsessively, not like you see in movies, but I found out where she lived. I learned her schedule. I waited until I knew she'd be alone. And then one night I knocked on her door with a fake petition about the very thing she cared about. She invited me in. His voice remained steady, clinical almost, but there was something underneath it now. Not quite emotion, but the memory of emotion, an echo. I was in her apartment for 6 hours. We talked for the first hour. She made tea. She showed me documents about the project, maps, data. She was so earnest, so hopeful that I was someone who could help. And I sat there and nodded and asked questions, and the whole time I knew what was going to happen. The whole time I was just waiting. He stopped, and the silence stretched out. Detective Chen waited, knowing somehow that interrupting now would break whatever thread he was following. When it happened, it was fast, faster than with Claire. I think I'd learned efficiency, or maybe I'd learned to not drag it out, to not make it worse than it had to be. Is that mercy? I don't know. she fought. She fought harder than Claire had. And when it was over, I cleaned everything. I took my time. I was methodical. I removed every trace of myself that I could. And then I left, and I drove home, and I took a shower, and I went to bed. His hands unfolded, lay flat on the table again. They found her 3 days later. A welfare check, when she didn't show up for work. The investigation went on for months. They never connected it to Claire because why would they? Different cities, different circumstances, different MO in the details. And I was never on their radar because I was nobody, just a stranger at a community meeting. My name wasn't even in their notes. Detective Chen's mind was racing, cross-referencing what she knew about unsolved cases in Cincinnati during that time frame. Jessica Marino. The name was familiar, very familiar. "You're remembering the case," Thomas said, reading her expression. "It got some media attention because of who she was, because of her work. People wanted it to mean something. They wanted her death to be connected to her advocacy, to be part of some larger conspiracy. But it wasn't. It was just random, just me." He looked down at his hands. "After Jessica, I promised myself it would stop. I promised myself the same thing I'd promised after Claire. But the promise meant even less this time, because now I knew the truth. I knew I was going to do it again. It was just a question of when." The confession was taking on a rhythm now, a terrible momentum. Detective Chen realized that Thomas had probably been rehearsing this, internally, for months, maybe years. This wasn't spontaneous. This was practiced, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of being necessary. He needed to tell it in a specific way, in a specific order, and he needed to be able to get through it without stopping. "I moved again," he said, "back to Ohio, but to a smaller city this time. Got a different job, doing the same kind of work but for a different firm. I was 30 years old. I looked young for my age. People trusted me. I had good references. I was quiet, but not too quiet. Friendly, but not overly friendly. I was exactly the right amount of everything to be invisible." He closed his eyes, and for a moment, Detective Chen thought he might be feeling ill, the cancer asserting itself. But when he opened them again, he continued. 18 months went by, then another one. Her name was Lisa Tran. She was a dental hygienist, 29 years old. I met her when I went in for a cleaning. She was gentle, professional. She told me I should floss more. Normal things, normal interaction. But I fixated on her, on the vulnerability of the position she was in, leaning over patients, trusting that they would behave, on how easy it would be to violate that trust. His voice had taken on that distant quality again. I went back 3 times over the next 2 months. Made up reasons, sensitivity, a possible cavity that turned out to be nothing. And each time I learned more. Where she parked her car, what time she left work, whether she lived alone. And yes, she did. She lived alone in a ground-floor apartment with a sliding glass door that didn't lock properly. I found that out by walking around the complex one night when I couldn't sleep. Detective Chen felt cold. She thought about all the women living alone, all the ground-floor apartments, all the locks that didn't quite work, all the ordinary vulnerabilities that most people never think about until it's too late. It happened on a Saturday night. She'd been out with friends, came home around 11. I was waiting in her apartment. I'd let myself in through that sliding door 3 hours earlier, just sat in the dark and waited. And when she came in and turned on the light, I was there. He paused, and something flickered across his face. Not quite regret, but something related to it. Something in the same family, Lisa begged. The others hadn't, not really. Claire had been too shocked. Jessica had fought instead of pleading. But Lisa begged. She told me about her family. Her younger brother who was in college, her mother who had health problems. She offered me money, offered me anything. She asked me why. She kept asking why. His voice dropped lower. I didn't have an answer for her. I still don't. There's no why that makes sense. No trauma in my childhood. No abuse. No precipitating event. I had a normal childhood. Loving parents. Middle-class suburban upbringing. Did well in school. Had friends. There's no story that explains this, and I think that's what people find most frightening. The idea that someone can be like me empty, without a reason, without a narrative. He looked at Detective Chen directly. They never found Lisa. Her body, I mean. She's still missing. Her case is still open. Her family still has vigils every year on the anniversary. I know because I've seen the news coverage. I've watched her mother give interviews, asking for any information, any closure. And I've sat in my living room and watched that and felt. He trailed off, searching for the word. Empty. I felt empty. Not guilty in the way you'd expect, just hollow. Like there was supposed to be something there, and there wasn't. The recorder kept running, the soft whir of the mechanism the only sound in the room for a long moment. Outside, someone walked past the door, their footsteps muffled by carpet, and the sound seemed to come from another universe entirely. I want to tell you where she is, Thomas said quietly. Lisa, I want to tell you where I left her, so her family can have that much at least, but not yet. I need to tell this in order. I need you to understand the progression, because that's the only thing that makes any sense out of this. Not the why, but the how, the pattern. Detective Chen nodded, her throat tight. She was thinking about Lisa, Tran's mother, about the vigils, about the not knowing. That was its own special kind of torture. But she also understood that if she pushed now, if she demanded that information immediately, Thomas might shut down entirely. This confession was happening on his terms, or not at all. After Lisa, I stopped for almost 2 years, Thomas continued. The longest gap. I moved again, this time to a different state entirely. Took a job in Pennsylvania, told myself I was starting over, and maybe I believed it for a while. I stopped thinking about it constantly, stopped noticing women in that way. Or, I thought I did. Maybe I was just better at lying to myself by then. He shifted in his chair, and Detective Chen saw him wince again, his hand moving unconsciously to his abdomen where the cancer was eating through him. During those 2 years, I did something I'd never done before. I went to therapy, not because I wanted to confess, or because I felt guilty in any useful way, but because I was curious. I wanted to understand what I was. So I lied to the therapist, told her I had depression and anxiety and trouble connecting with people, which was all true in its way, and she tried to help me. She was kind and patient, and she gave me tools for emotional regulation and mindfulness, and all of these things that were completely irrelevant to what I actually was. A pause, and that bitter, almost laugh again. I think she thought she was helping. I think she thought I was making progress, and in a way, maybe I was. I was learning to perform normalcy better, learning to recognize the signs of what I was feeling, so I could hide them more effectively. I was becoming a better mimic. He looked at his hands, spreading the fingers, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. The thing is, during those 2 years, I almost convinced myself that I'd stopped, that I'd evolved past it somehow. I dated someone for 8 months, a woman named Karen who worked in marketing. She was smart and funny, and she didn't deserve what I was. But I was careful with her. I never let her see anything real. And when she ended it, when she said she felt like she didn't really know me, even after all that time, I agreed with her, because she was right. She didn't know me. Nobody did. The light in the room had shifted slightly, the sun moving behind clouds outside. Everything took on a grayer cast, and then it happened again. And this time, it was different, because this time, I knew I wasn't going to stop. This time, there was no pretense of it being the last time, no promises to myself. I'd accepted what I was. He breathed in slowly, breathed out. Her name was Amanda Reeves. She was 31, an accountant. I met her at a professional networking event. We talked about tax law and urban development projects and completely boring, normal things. She gave me her card. I called her a week later about a legitimate consultation for a project I was working on. We met for coffee to discuss it. Everything was professional, appropriate, and the whole time I was planning it, Detective Chen forced herself to remain still, to not react, even as her mind was cataloging names, cross-referencing cases, thinking about all the unsolved disappearances and murders that might be connected to the man sitting across from her. It took me 3 months with Amanda. 3 months of building trust, of professional interactions, of becoming someone she knew and felt comfortable with. And then I engineered a situation where I needed to drop off some documents at her house one evening. She invited me in, offered me a drink. We talked about the project, and then I killed her. The words were so flat, so matter-of-fact, that they almost didn't register at first. I was more confident by then, more practiced. I knew how to control the situation, how to minimize risk. I knew what mistakes I'd made before and how to avoid them. I'd become efficient, clinical, and that's what frightens me most when I look back. Not the violence itself, but how good I got at it, how it became almost routine. He closed his eyes again, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. After Amanda, something changed. I started taking longer between them, but I never stopped completely. There was always another one, always someone I noticed, someone I fixated on, someone who became the next name on a list that only existed in my head. Detective Chen found her voice again. How many? Thomas opened his eyes and looked at her. Before Rachel, 6 total. Claire, Jessica, Lisa, Amanda, and 2 others whose names I'll tell you. After Rachel, 3 more. The last one was 4 years ago. That's when I found out I was sick. That's when everything started shutting down, physically. The cancer saved lives, probably. Strange to think about it that way. 9 victims, 9 women, 9 families destroyed. The number hung in the air between them like a physical thing. But Rachel was different, Thomas said, and his voice changed slightly, took on a different quality. Rachel was the one I almost didn't do, the one I came closest to stopping myself. He leaned forward slightly, and Detective Chen could see the effort it took, the pain he was pushing through. I'd been living here for about 8 months when I first saw her, at the library. I went there sometimes to work, to use the quiet study rooms, and she was always there, always helpful, always kind to everyone. She had this way of really listening when people talked to her. You know how rare that is, to be truly heard. There was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before, something that might have been genuine emotion. I started going to the library more often, started timing my visits to when she was working, started having brief conversations with her about books, about her studies. She was getting her master's in psychology. She wanted to be a therapist, to help people. The irony wasn't lost on me. He paused, and the silence stretched. I knew I was going to kill her. I knew it from the first moment I started noticing her in that way. But with Rachel, I hesitated. I spent months just watching her, just talking to her in those brief professional interactions. And I told myself I was planning, but really, I think I was stalling, because there was something about her that made me feel almost human again. Something about the way she listened, the way she looked at people like they mattered. His hands clenched slightly on the table. She was engaged. Did you know that? Her fiancé's name was Michael. He came to pick her up from work sometimes. I saw them together once, in the parking lot. The way he looked at her, the way she smiled at him. And I remember standing there watching them, and feeling something close to regret for what I was going to do. Not enough to stop me, never enough to stop me, but something. Detective Chen thought about Michael Denning, about the man who'd spent 17 years not knowing what happened to the woman he was supposed to marry, about the life that had been stolen from both of them. The night it happened, I hadn't planned it for that day. I'd been at the library doing actual work, actual research for a project. And when I left, when I walked out to my car, I saw her leaving too. Saw her walking to her car, alone. The parking lot was mostly empty. It was getting dark, and something just clicked into place. He stopped, and the weight of what he was about to describe filled the room. I followed her to her car, called her name. She turned around and smiled, recognized me. I told her I was having car trouble, asked if she could help. She didn't hesitate. That's what kills me, looking back. She didn't hesitate. She trusted me because I'd been kind to her, because I'd been a familiar face, because nothing in her experience had taught her that familiar faces could be the most dangerous ones. His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. I grabbed her before she could scream. I had my hand over her mouth and my other arm around her, and I dragged her away from her car, away from the light. There was a maintenance area behind the library, a service road that wasn't well lit. I got her there, and he trailed off, and for the first time, he seemed unable to continue. Detective Chen waited, and the silence expanded until it felt unbearable. I killed her, he finally said. I killed her, and I left her there, and I went home. And the next day, when the news broke, when her car was found and she was missing, and the whole campus was in shock, I went about my day. I went to work. I ate lunch. I functioned. He looked up at Detective Chen, and there might have been tears in his eyes, but she couldn't be sure. When they questioned me, I was calm. I'd been expecting it. I'd been at the library. I was probably on camera. My name was in the checkout records. So I told them the truth about that part. Yes, I was there. Yes, I checked out books. Yes, I left around 8, and then I lied about everything else. I said I drove straight home. I said I didn't see Rachel in the parking lot. I took their polygraph, and I passed it, because by then I'd learned how to separate the truth from the lies in my own head. I'd learned how to believe my own story. They searched my house, Thomas continued, his voice steady again now, back to that clinical, narrative tone. They searched my car. They took samples, fibers, hair, everything, and they found nothing, because I'd been careful, because I'd learned, because by the time I killed Rachel, I was good at this. That's the part that should horrify people, I think. Not that I did it, but that I'd become skilled at it. That practice had made me better. He shifted again, grimacing. Detective Chen noticed a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the room. The investigation went on for months. I watched it unfold from the inside and the outside simultaneously. I was questioned 3 more times. Different detectives, different approaches. Good cop, bad cop, sympathetic listener, aggressive interrogator. I adjusted to each one. I gave them nothing, because there was nothing to give. I'd erased myself from that scene so completely that I might as well have never been there. A pause, and he looked directly at Detective Chen. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the investigation. It wasn't the fear of being caught, though that was there in the background, always. The worst part was watching her family. Rachel's parents held a press conference a week after she disappeared. I watched it on television. Her mother couldn't stop crying. Her father read a prepared statement, but he kept breaking down. And Michael, her fiancé, he just sat there looking like someone had hollowed him out from the inside. His voice dropped lower. I told myself I felt nothing. That's what I'd always told myself. But watching that press conference, I felt something. Not guilt, exactly. Not remorse, in any way that would have changed anything. But something. A recognition. Maybe. An understanding that I'd created this grief, this particular configuration of pain, and it would ripple out forever. Rachel would never be found, never be buried, never be mourned properly, and that incompleteness would poison everything it touched. Detective Chen's mind was racing. Where is she? Where did you leave Rachel? Thomas shook his head slowly. I'll tell you where all of them are, but let me finish first. Let me get through this the way I need to. He took a breath, wincing again. After Rachel, I left town. Not immediately, that would have been suspicious. But 8 months later, I took a job in another state. Told everyone I needed a change, needed new opportunities. No one questioned it. Why would they? I wasn't a suspect anymore. I was just another person moving on with their life. The light had dimmed further outside. Detective Chen realized they'd been in this room for over an hour. It felt like years. The 3 after Rachel, they were different, quicker, more impersonal. I think part of me had broken after Rachel, had accepted fully what I was, and there was no more pretending, no more hesitation, no more almost feeling something. He counted them off on his fingers, and the gesture was grotesque in its mundanity. Melissa Hartley, 33, nurse. I met her at a hospital where I was visiting a colleague who'd had surgery. We talked in the cafeteria. She was kind. 3 weeks later, I followed her home from her night shift and killed her in her own driveway. Made it look like a robbery gone wrong. They never connected it to me because I was nobody to her, just a stranger she'd talked to once. His second finger, Jennifer Yao, 26, teacher. I met her at a community center where she taught an adult education class on local history. I attended 3 sessions, learned where she lived, learned she jogged alone early in the morning, found her on a trail one morning before dawn, made it look like she'd fallen, hit her head, natural causes. They ruled it an accident. No investigation beyond the basics. His third finger, and Sarah Chen. The name hung in the air, and Detective Chen felt the blood drain from her face. Sarah Chen, her aunt, her mother's younger sister, dead 6 years ago in what had been ruled a home invasion. Sarah Chen, who she'd been named after, who she'd never met because she'd been killed 2 years before Detective Chen was born. No, that wasn't right. The timeline was wrong. She'd been named after her aunt who died when Chen was a baby. But the years the details, they were suddenly all wrong in her head. Not you, Thomas said quietly, reading her reaction. Different, Sarah Chen. No relation, I assume, though the coincidence must be disturbing. She was 28, real estate agent. I met her at an open house. She showed me 3 properties over 2 weeks, professional, friendly, helpful. And then one evening, I asked to see a vacant property one more time, said I was seriously considering it. She met me there. We were alone in an empty house, and I killed her there and left her there, and it was 3 days before anyone found her. Detective Chun's hands were shaking. She folded them in her lap where Thomas couldn't see. The name was a coincidence. It had to be. But the impact of hearing it, of imagining for one terrible moment that this monster sitting across from her had touched her family, had made her understand something visceral about all the other families he'd destroyed. That was 4 years ago, Thomas said. And then I got sick, started feeling wrong, started losing weight, started having pain that wouldn't go away. By the time I was diagnosed, it was already advanced, already terminal, and I found myself thinking about all of them, all 9 of them, their names, their faces, the way they'd looked at me in those final moments. He closed his eyes. I don't dream about them. I never have. But I think about them when I'm awake. I think about the lives they would have lived. Rachel would have been 41 now. She'd probably have children. Maybe she'd be a therapist, helping people. Claire would be 46. Lisa would be 43. All these lives, stretching forward into futures that I erased. His eyes opened again, and they were dry. No tears, just that terrible emptiness. And I realized that when I died, they'd die again. More finally this time. Because right now, I'm the only person who knows what happened to all of them. I'm the only one who knows where Lisa is, where Rachel is. I'm the only one who knows that Jennifer Yao didn't die in an accident. I'm the only one who can give their families answers. He leaned forward slightly. So I started thinking about this confession, about whether it meant anything, about whether it mattered, and I couldn't decide if telling you was an act of mercy or an act of final cruelty, giving them answers, but also giving them the knowledge of exactly how much their daughters, their sisters, their fiancés suffered, taking away the small comfort of imagined quick deaths or peaceful endings. Detective Chen found her voice, though it came out rougher than she intended. It matters. The truth always matters, does it? Thomas asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice. I'm not being rhetorical. I really want to know. Does the truth matter if it only brings more pain? If it only confirms the worst fears? If it doesn't change anything except replacing one kind of torture with another? Yes, Detective Chen said firmly. Because not knowing is its own torture. Because families deserve to bury their dead. Because the truth is the only thing that allows people to begin to heal, even if the healing is incomplete. Thomas studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I hope you're right. I hope this matters, because if it doesn't, then I've wasted my last months on Earth, and I've wasted your time, and I've caused pain for nothing. He sat back, and the movement seemed to cost him. The pain was getting worse. Detective Chen could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way he held his body. I need a break, he said quietly. Can we take a break? I need to take my medication, and then I'll tell you where they all are. I'll tell you everything, every detail, but I need 10 minutes. Detective Chen nodded and reached for the recorder, pausing it. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Thomas stood, slowly, carefully, and Detective Chen stood as well. A uniformed officer was called in to escort him to a restroom, to stay with him. Protocol, even though Thomas wasn't under arrest, even though he'd come here voluntarily. When he was gone, Detective Chen stood alone in the room and let herself shake, let herself feel the horror of what she'd been listening to. She thought about calling her supervisor, about stopping this, about reading Thomas's rights and arresting him right now. But she knew that if she did, he might stop talking. He might invoke his right to an attorney, and then all those families would never know. Lisa Tran would stay missing forever. Rachel Denning would remain unfound. So she waited. She got herself a cup of water from the cooler in the hall. She breathed. And when Thomas was brought back 10 minutes later, looking even paler but more composed, she sat back down across from him and restarted the recorder. Ready? she asked. Ready, he said. And then he began to tell her where the bodies were buried. Thomas folded his hands on the table again, that same precise gesture, and when he spoke, his voice had taken on a different quality, more methodical, like he was reading coordinates off a map only he could see. Lisa Tran, he began, the one who begged, the one whose family still holds vigils. She's in Shawnee State Forest, Southern Ohio. There's a hiking trail called the Backpack Trail. About 7 miles in, there's a fork. Take the left fork, go another half mile. There's a ravine on the east side, steep, covered in undergrowth. At the bottom of that ravine, underneath a fallen oak tree that's probably mostly rotted by now, I buried her, 3 feet down. I wrapped her in plastic sheeting first, then a tarp. I spent 6 hours digging that hole in the middle of the night with a camping shovel. He said it so calmly, so precisely, that it took Detective Chen a moment to process the horror of what he was describing. The premeditation, the effort, the fact that he'd hiked 7.5 miles into a forest, carrying a body, a shovel, plastic sheeting, and dug a grave in darkness. You'll find her, Thomas continued. The landmarks are still there. The oak tree split down the middle, lightning strike probably. You can't miss it if you're looking. I go back there sometimes. Went back, before I got too sick to hike, just to make sure no one had stumbled on it accidentally. No one ever did. Detective Chen was writing quickly, noting every detail. Shawnee State Forest, Backpack Trail, 7 miles, left fork, half mile, ravine, oak tree. She'd have teams out there by tomorrow morning. Rachel Denning, Thomas said, and his voice changed slightly. That same subtle shift she'd heard earlier when he'd talked about her. Rachel is closer. She's been close this whole time. There's a nature preserve on the edge of campus. You know the one. Oak Ridge Preserve. There's a maintenance shed on the north side, locked, barely used. Behind that shed, there's a drainage culvert, concrete, probably 4 feet in diameter. It runs under the access road. I put her in that culvert, back where it widens out underground. 20 feet in, there's a junction. I sealed her in the left junction with concrete blocks and mortar, built a wall, made it look like it had always been there. Detective Chen felt sick. Oak Ridge Preserve. She'd walked there. She'd been a student at that campus years after Rachel had disappeared, had probably walked past that very shed dozens of times. Rachel Denning had been there the whole time, 20 feet underground, behind a wall, while search parties combed the woods and dragged ponds, and her family begged for information. You'll need equipment to break through the wall, Thomas said. The concrete will have set completely by now, but she's there. Everything that's left of her. I'm sorry I couldn't bury her properly. I'm sorry she's been in the dark all this time. The apology sounded sincere, and somehow that made it worse. As if sorry could mean anything after 17 years. As if sorry could give Rachel back her wedding that never happened, the children she never had, the life that had been stolen in a parking lot on a Thursday evening in March. Claire Hutchison, Thomas continued, moving methodically through his list. The first one, she's in Columbus, like I said. There's a development on the east side, subdivision that was being built when I lived there. It's all houses now, probably. Maple Ridge subdivision. She's under one of those houses, under the foundation. I worked on the development project in a tangential way, had access to the construction site. One night I brought her there, put her in a foundation trench that was going to be poured the next day. They poured concrete over her the following morning. Someone's living room is built on top of her grave. The horror of it was almost incomprehensible. A woman's body sealed in concrete, a family living above her, children playing, dinners being eaten, lives being lived, while Claire Hutchison lay entombed beneath them. You'll need ground-penetrating radar, Thomas said, and you'll need to check the records from that development to see which foundations were poured in late January that year. There were only 3 houses at that stage. One of them has Claire. I can't remember which one exactly. It was dark. I was focused on other things. But she's there. Detective Chen was writing faster now, her hand cramping. The details were piling up, each one more nightmarish than the last. Amanda Reeves, Thomas said. The accountant. She's in Pennsylvania, outside Pittsburgh. There's a state park, McConnell's Mill. There's an old abandoned mill building, been closed for decades, structurally unsafe, fenced off. I cut through the fence one night, brought her there. Inside the mill, there's a basement level, flooded partially. The water's maybe 2 feet deep, stagnant. I weighed her down with chains and cinder blocks and put her in that water. The building's been condemned. No one goes there. She's been underwater for 9 years. 9 years underwater, in a flooded basement, in an abandoned mill. Detective Chen thought about decomposition, about what would be left, about whether Amanda Reeves' family would even be able to identify her remains. But they'd know. They'd finally know what happened. Jessica Marino, Thomas continued. His voice was starting to sound strained now, tired. The medication was wearing off, or the effort of confession was taking its toll. The environmental advocate. She's in Cincinnati. There's a warehouse district on the west side. Lots of abandoned buildings. One of them was an old manufacturing plant, 3 stories, mostly gutted. I broke in through a window on the ground floor, brought her there, top floor, in what used to be an equipment room. I hid her body in a large metal cabinet, the kind they used for storing industrial supplies, welded it shut. The building's probably been demolished by now, honestly. That whole area was slated for redevelopment. But if it's still standing, she's in that cabinet, on the top floor, northeast corner. Detective Chen made a note to check property records, to see if that building still existed, if it had been demolished, if Jessica's body had been destroyed in the process, carried off to a landfill in pieces of twisted metal. Another horror compounded on top of horror. Thomas paused, closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were more bloodshot than before. The last 3, after Rachel. I'll make these quick, because I can feel myself running out of time here. The pain is getting worse. Detective Chen wanted to tell him to take another break, but she was afraid that if they stopped now, he might not be able to start again. Go ahead, she said quietly. Melissa Hartley, the nurse. I killed her in her driveway, like I said, but I came back the next night. There was a construction dumpster, 3 houses down, renovation project. I put her in that dumpster, covered her with construction debris. The dumpster was emptied 2 days later. She's in a landfill somewhere, outside of Richmond, Virginia. I don't know which one. I don't know if you'll ever find her. I'm sorry. He was apologizing again, and Detective Chen wanted to scream. Sorry didn't matter. Sorry was meaningless. But she stayed silent, kept writing. Jennifer Yao, the teacher, the one they think died in an accident. She didn't fall. I strangled her and staged the scene. But I left her there on that trail. She was found. She was buried. Her family has closure in that sense. What I'm giving you is the truth about how she died. That it wasn't an accident. That someone did it to her deliberately. I don't know if that's a gift or a curse to her family. Detective Chen's hand was shaking as she wrote. Jennifer Yao's family thought their daughter had died in a tragic accident. Now they'd learned she'd been murdered. Was Thomas right? Was the truth more painful than the lie? And Sarah Chen, Thomas said, looking directly at Detective Chen as he said the name, watching for her reaction again. The real estate agent. I killed her in that vacant house, like I said. But when they found her, when they investigated, they assumed it was a random home invasion. Someone breaking in, encountering her, panicking. They never looked for a connection between us, because I'd covered my tracks. I'd paid for the house showings in cash, used a fake name. I was nobody to the investigation. He paused. But she's not missing. She was found. She was buried. Her family had a funeral. What I'm giving you is the knowledge that it wasn't random, that I planned it, that I targeted her specifically. I don't know if that changes anything for them, but it's the truth. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the movement slow and pained. That's all of them. 9 women, 6 bodies still missing that you now know how to find. 3 that were found but misunderstood, and Rachel, who's been underground for 17 years, 20 feet away from where thousands of students have walked, where her fiancé probably walked looking for her. His voice cracked on the last words, the first real sign of emotion breaking through. I need you to understand something, he said quietly. I'm not telling you this because I want forgiveness. I'm not telling you this because I think it makes me a better person. I'm telling you this because these women deserve to be found. They deserve to have their families know what happened. They deserve to not be forgotten, to not be just another unsolved case that gets filed away. Detective Chen looked at him, at this ordinary-looking man who had destroyed so many lives, who had carried this knowledge for so many years, who was now dying and had decided that his death shouldn't also mean the death of the truth. "What you deserve," she said carefully, "is to spend whatever time you have left in prison. You'll be arrested as soon as we finish here." "You know that." "I know," Thomas said. "I'm not expecting anything else. 6 months, 8 months, maybe I die before trial. Maybe I die in a cell. I've accepted that. What I couldn't accept was dying with all of this still locked inside me. Dying and taking 9 women's stories with me." He looked down at his hands again. "Do you believe in hell, detective?" The question caught her off guard. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I do," Thomas said quietly. "I didn't used to, but I do now. And I think I've been in it for years already. Not fire and brimstone, just emptiness. Just the knowledge of what I am and what I've done, and the inability to ever undo any of it. That's hell. Knowing that even if I told the truth, even if I gave back what little I could give back, it would never be enough. It would never make any of it right." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of 9 lives, 9 families, 17 years of lies and searching and grief. Detective Chen looked at the man across from her and tried to reconcile what she was seeing, this tired, sick, ordinary-looking person with the monster he'd described. The man who had planned and executed 9 murders over the span of 14 years. The man who had walked among normal people, had jobs, had relationships, had therapists who thought they were helping him, all while carrying this darkness inside him. "I want to ask you something," Detective Chen said finally, "and I need you to be honest. Is there anyone else? Anyone you haven't told me about?" Thomas met her eyes, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, 9 is the number. I've been over it in my head 1,000 times, making sure I hadn't forgotten anyone, hadn't blocked anything out. 9 women, over 14 years. That's all of them." "How can I believe you?" Detective Chen asked. "How can I trust that you're not still lying, still holding something back?" "You can't," Thomas said simply. "You can't believe me. All you can do is investigate what I've told you. Search the places I've described. Find the bodies I've said are there. And if I'm lying about any of it, if you find evidence of others, or if you don't find the ones I've described, then you'll know. But I'm not lying. Not anymore. That's the only freedom I have left. The truth." Detective Chen wanted to believe him, but she also knew that serial killers lied. They manipulated. They controlled information as their last source of power. How many times had she read about cases where a killer confessed to some murders but held back others, using that information as leverage, as a way to stay relevant, to keep people coming back? "Why, Rachel?" she asked suddenly. "You said she was different. You said you hesitated with her. So why did you do it? What made you go through with it that night?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer, more reflective. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense. With the others, there was always this momentum, this building pressure that would reach a point where I just acted. But with Rachel, it was different. I'd been watching her for months. Months of going to the library, of these small interactions, of feeling like maybe I was capable of something other than what I was." He paused, searching for words. "And then that night, seeing her in the parking lot, seeing her alone and vulnerable, something just clicked, like a switch flipping. And I wasn't thinking about all those months of hesitation anymore. I wasn't thinking about her fiancé or her future or anything human about her. I was just acting, following a script I'd written so many times before that my body knew what to do, even when my mind was barely present." "Did she know?" Detective Chen asked quietly at the end. "Did she know it was you?" "Yes," Thomas said, and the single word carried enormous weight. "She recognized me. I saw it in her eyes. That moment of confusion, of not understanding why someone familiar was doing this, and then the understanding, and then the fear. That's what I see when I close my eyes now. That moment when she understood." Detective Chen felt her chest tighten. She thought about Rachel Denning, 24 years old, graduate student, about to be married, being murdered by someone she'd been kind to, someone she'd helped find books, someone she'd smiled at. Her fiancé, Detective Chen said. Michael, he never gave up looking for her. He spent 17 years searching, calling in tips, organizing searches. He never remarried, never moved on. What do you want me to tell him? Thomas flinched, the first visible sign that something had penetrated that careful calm he'd been maintaining. I don't know. What can you tell him? That she died quickly. She didn't. That she didn't suffer. She did. That I'm sorry. What does that mean? How does sorry help him? It doesn't, Detective Chen said flatly. Nothing helps him. Nothing gives him back 17 years. Nothing brings Rachel back. But at least he'll know. At least he can stop searching. At least he can bury her. Tell him that she fought, Thomas said quietly. Tell him that she was brave. Tell him that in those final moments, she said his name. She said, Michael, I'm sorry. I don't know what she was sorry for. Maybe for leaving him. Maybe for not being more careful. Maybe for nothing. But she said his name. Detective Chen felt tears pressing at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of this man. Anything else. Tell him that I'm sorry I took her from him, Thomas said. I know it doesn't matter. I know it doesn't change anything. But tell him anyway. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, Detective Chen could hear voices in the hallway, the normal sounds of a building full of people doing their jobs, having conversations, living their lives. It seemed impossible that the world could continue on normally while this confession was happening, while 9 families' worst nightmares were being confirmed in this small room. What happens now? Thomas asked finally. Now I call my supervisor, Detective Chen said, and you'll be formally arrested. You'll be read your rights. You'll be processed. And then we'll start verifying everything you've told us. We'll send teams to every location you described. We'll start notifying families. We'll build cases. Multiple cases across multiple jurisdictions. It's going to take months, maybe years, and you'll be in custody for all of it. Will you be the one to tell them? Thomas asked. The families. Some of them, probably. Why? Because you listened, Thomas said simply. You listened to all of it without judgment, without interruption. You let me tell it the way I needed to tell it. And I think when you tell the families, you'll do it with that same care. You'll make sure they understand that their daughters, their sisters, their fiancés, they mattered. That even in my confession, they were the important ones, not me. Detective Chen stood up. They were always the important ones. You were never important. You're just the person who ended their stories. But their stories were theirs long before you touched them, and they'll be remembered long after you're forgotten. Thomas nodded slowly. I hope you're right. I hope I'm forgotten. I hope, when this is all over, when all the bodies are found, and all the cases are closed, people remember Rachel and Claire and Lisa and Jessica and Amanda and Melissa and Jennifer and Sarah and the other Sarah. I hope they remember their names and their lives. And I hope my name fades into nothing. It won't, Detective Chen said honestly. That's not how this works. Your name will be in headlines. There will be documentaries and articles and true crime podcasts. People will try to understand you, to figure out what made you this way. You'll be remembered whether you want to be or not. Then I hope they get it wrong, Thomas said. I hope they make up some tragic backstory. I hope they find some trauma to explain it. Because the truth that I was just like this, that there's no reason, no explanation, that's too frightening for people to accept. Detective Chen walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Was there ever a moment when you thought about stopping, when you thought about turning yourself in? Thomas considered the question. Every time, he said finally. After each one, there was a moment, sometimes just seconds, sometimes days, when I thought about it, when I thought about walking into a police station and confessing, when I thought about ending it. But then the moment would pass, and I'd convince myself that there was no point, that confessing wouldn't bring them back, that it would only cause more pain, that I could just stop on my own, and that would be enough. But you couldn't stop. No, he said quietly, I couldn't stop, or I didn't stop. I'm not sure which is more accurate. I'm not sure how much of it was compulsion and how much was choice. Maybe that's the question I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to answer. Detective Chen opened the door. 2 uniformed officers were waiting outside, along with her supervisor, Captain Morrison, who must have been called while she was in the room. Morrison's face was grim, his jaw set. Thomas Calloway, Detective Chen said formally, "You're under arrest for the murders of Rachel Denning, Claire Hutchison, Lisa Tran, Jessica Moreno, Amanda Reeves, Melissa Hartley, Jennifer Yao, and Sarah Chen." She paused. "And based on information you've provided, we'll be investigating 9 deaths across multiple jurisdictions. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights, as I've read them to you?" "I understand," Thomas said. He stood slowly, wincing again at the pain. "I don't want an attorney. I'm pleading guilty to everything. I'll sign whatever confession you need. I'll testify if necessary. I just want this to be over." "You'll still be assigned a public defender," Captain Morrison said. "That's protocol." Thomas nodded. "Fine, but tell them not to bother with a defense. There is no defense. I did everything I've confessed to. I'm guilty. I just want to make sure the families get their answers. That's all I care about now." The officers moved forward to handcuff him. Thomas held out his hands without resistance. As they clicked the cuffs into place, he looked at Detective Chen one more time. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." Detective Chen didn't respond. She watched as they led him away, this ordinary-looking man who had caused so much extraordinary pain. She watched until he disappeared around a corner, and then she stood alone in the hallway with Captain Morrison. "Jesus Christ," Morrison said quietly. 9 victims. 9 confirmed," Detective Chen said. "We'll need to cross-reference with unsolved cases in every city he's lived in. Make sure there aren't others." "You think he's lying, holding back?" "I don't know," Chen admitted. "Part of me wants to believe him, that he's told us everything, that this is really about giving the families closure. But serial killers lie. They manipulate. We need to verify every single thing he said." "We'll start immediately," Morrison said. "I'll coordinate with the other jurisdictions. Get teams to all those locations. This is going to be massive. Media's going to be all over it." Detective Chen nodded. She was already thinking about the phone calls she'd have to make, the families she'd have to notify. Michael Denning, who'd finally learn what happened to his fiancée. Lisa Tran's mother, who'd held vigils for 18 years. All the parents and siblings and friends who'd been waiting for answers. "I need to make some calls," she said. "Take a few minutes first," Morrison said. "Process this." That was a hell of a thing to sit through, but Detective Chen was already walking away, pulling out her phone. There was no time to process. There was too much work to do, too many families waiting, too many bodies to find. Behind her, in a holding cell, Thomas Calloway sat on a narrow bench and closed his eyes. The confession was over. The truth was out. Soon the excavations would begin. The bodies would be found. The cases would be closed. And he would die in a cell somewhere, finally empty of secrets, finally done with carrying the weight of 9 lives he'd stolen. He thought about hell, about whether it was real, about whether what came after could possibly be worse than what he'd lived with for 17 years. The knowledge of what he was, the memory of their faces, the understanding that he'd destroyed not just 9 lives, but dozens families, friends, fiancés, all the people connected to his victims, whose lives had been irrevocably changed. And he realized that it didn't matter if hell existed in any literal sense. He'd been living in it for years, and now, finally, it was almost over. 3 days after the confession, the first body was found. Detective Chen stood at the edge of Oak Ridge Preserve, watching as the excavation team worked to break through the concrete wall in the drainage culvert. It was early morning, mist still hanging in the air, and the preserve was closed to the public. Police tape cordoned off the entire north section. News helicopters circled overhead despite the no-fly zone. Word had leaked, as it always did. By now, the whole country knew about Thomas Calloway and his confession. The team leader emerged from the culvert, his face grim. He pulled off his mask and nodded once at Detective Chen. They'd found her. After 17 years, Rachel Denning was coming home. Detective Chen closed her eyes and thought about Michael Denning. She'd called him the day after Thomas's arrest, had driven to his apartment and told him in person. He'd sat on his couch and stared at her without speaking for a full 5 minutes. Then he'd asked, very quietly, if Rachel had suffered, and Detective Chen had done what Thomas had asked. She'd told him that Rachel had fought, that she'd been brave, that in those final moments she'd said his name. Michael had broken down then, sobbing in a way that was painful to witness. 17 years of hope and denial and desperate searching, all crashing down at once. But through the tears, he'd said thank you. Thank you for finding her. Thank you for bringing her home. Now, watching the careful extraction process, Detective Chen thought about all the other families who were waiting. Lisa Tran's mother, who'd answered Detective Chen's call with a trembling voice and said, "You found her. You found my baby." Claire Hutchison's brother, who'd been only 16 when his sister disappeared and was now 39 with children of his own. Amanda Reeves' parents, who'd moved 3 times, trying to escape the memories, but carried them everywhere anyway. The second body was found for days later. Lisa Tran, exactly where Thomas had said, in Shawnee State Forest. The fallen oak tree, the ravine, 3 feet down. Everything matched. The forensics team confirmed identity through dental records. Within 24 hours, Detective Chen called Lisa's mother and listened to her cry. 18 years of vigils, 18 years of not knowing, and now knowing. Jessica Marino's case was more complicated. The warehouse had been demolished 3 years earlier, but investigators found records showing that the large metal cabinets from the top floor had been salvaged and sold to a scrapyard. The scrapyard still had them, waiting to be processed. Inside one of them, welded shut as Thomas had described, they found what remained of Jessica Moreno. Her family had believed for 15 years that she'd been killed because of her environmental advocacy, that her death had meant something larger. Now they learned it had been random, meaningless, just wrong place, wrong time, wrong person noticing her. Claire Hutchison took the longest ground-penetrating radar on 3 houses in Maple Ridge subdivision. The third house showed an anomaly in the foundation. The family living there had to be relocated, while investigators broke through their living room floor, jackhammered through concrete, and found human remains sealed inside. The family would never return to that house. How could you live somewhere knowing what was underneath? How could you sleep knowing you'd been sleeping above a grave? Amanda Reeves was recovered from the flooded basement of the abandoned mill. 9 years underwater had taken their toll, but there was enough left for identification. Her father flew in from California to identify personal items found with the body: a ring, a watch that had stopped at 9:47 p.m. on a night 9 years ago. He held these things in his hands and wept. Melissa Hartley was never found. The landfill outside Richmond was too vast, too many years of refuse piled on top of refuse. They searched for weeks, but found nothing. Her family would have to live with knowing what happened, but never being able to bury her. It was, in some ways, the cruelest outcome. Truth without closure. Jennifer Yao's case reopened. Her death reclassified from accident to homicide. Her family's grief reopened like a wound that had never properly healed. We'd made peace with it, her sister told Detective Chen. We'd accepted that it was a terrible accident. Now we have to grieve her all over again. But this time, knowing someone chose to kill her. Sarah Chen's case was similarly reopened. The real estate agent who'd been killed in a vacant house. The investigation that had gone nowhere. Now detectives were going back through evidence, looking for traces of the man who'd called himself someone else, who'd paid in cash, who'd planned everything. Her brother told the press that knowing the truth was worse than the lie. At least before, he'd thought his sister had just been unlucky. Now he knew she'd been hunted. Through all of this, Thomas Calloway sat in a county jail cell and deteriorated. The cancer was aggressive, moving faster than the 6-month timeline his doctors had initially given him. He'd waived all rights to a trial, pled guilty to all charges in multiple jurisdictions. The legal system was moving as quickly as it could, but there were procedures, protocols, jurisdictional complications. It was possible he'd die before sentencing. It was probable he'd die before serving any meaningful time. This fact enraged some people. Talk show hosts railed about how he was escaping justice. Social media exploded with anger that he'd get to die peacefully in a cell instead of spending decades in prison. But others pointed out that he was dying of cancer, that there was no peaceful about it, that he was in constant pain and would be until the end. Detective Chen didn't know how she felt about it. Justice seemed like an inadequate word for any of this. 9 women were dead. 9 families were destroyed. Nothing that happened to Thomas Calloway would change that. Whether he lived 6 more months or 6 more years, whether he died in a cell or a hospital, it didn't bring anyone back. It didn't undo anything. 6 weeks after his confession, Detective Chen visited him in jail. She told herself it was for professional reasons, that she needed to verify some final details, but really, she wanted to see him, wanted to understand if anything had changed. If confession had brought him any kind of peace or redemption. He looked terrible. The cancer had eaten away at him, leaving him skeletal. His skin had a grayish cast. His eyes were sunken, but when he saw her, he smiled slightly. "Detective Chen," he said, his voice hoarse. "Come to see the dying monster." "I came to tell you, we found them," she said. "All of them, except Melissa. We found 7 of the 9 bodies. The families have their answers." Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or just exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me. I've been wondering if I got the locations right, if my memory was accurate. I was worried I might have led you to empty graves." "Your memory was perfect," Detective Chen said, and there was something bitter in her voice. "Every detail exactly as you described." "Of course it was," Thomas said quietly. "I told you. I remember everything." They sat in silence for a moment, separated by bulletproof glass, speaking through phones. "Do you regret it?" Detective Chen asked. "Not the murders. I know you're not capable of that kind of remorse. But the confession. Do you regret telling me?" Thomas considered this. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it, but I don't feel better either. I thought maybe I would. Thought maybe confession would lift some weight. But the weight is still there. If anything, it's heavier now. Because now it's not just my burden. Now 9 families are carrying it too." "They were always carrying it," Detective Chen said. "You just gave them the truth to carry instead of questions." "Is that better?" Thomas asked. "I genuinely don't know. Is knowing better than wondering?" Detective Chen thought about Michael Denning, about Lisa Tran's mother, about all the families she'd spoken to. Some of them had said yes, knowing was better. Others had said they wished they could go back to not knowing, to when there was still hope. However false, there was no universal answer. "I think people deserve the truth," she said, "even when it's painful, even when it doesn't bring comfort, because the alternative is living in a lie, and that's its own kind of torture." Thomas nodded slowly. "I hope you're right. I hope I gave them something valuable and not just more pain." "You didn't give them anything," Detective Chen said sharply. "You took from them. You took their daughters, their sisters, their fiancés. You took years of their lives. You took their peace. The only thing you gave them was information you should have given 17 years ago." Thomas flinched, but didn't argue. "You're right. Of course you're right. I don't know why I'm still trying to frame this as some kind of gift, force of habit, maybe. The desire to be seen as something other than what I am." "What are you?" Detective Chen asked. "In your own words, what do you think you are?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Empty," he said finally. "I'm empty. I've always been empty. That's what I couldn't explain to you during the confession. That's what I can't explain to anyone. There's no rage inside me, no passion, no feeling. I killed those women not because I felt too much, but because I felt too little. I was trying to feel something, anything, and killing them gave me that for a moment, made me feel present, made me feel real." He leaned forward slightly, and Detective Chen could see the effort it cost him, but it never lasted. The feeling would fade, and I'd be empty again. And I'd start noticing someone else, and the cycle would repeat. 9 times over 14 years. 9 attempts to feel human. 9 failures. "You are human," Detective Chen said. "That's what makes this so terrible. You're not a monster from a horror movie. You're a human being who made choices, who chose to kill, who chose to lie, who chose silence, for 17 years. That's worse than being a monster, because it means anyone could be you. Thomas smiled, and it was a sad, tired smile. That's what keeps you up at night, isn't it? The knowledge that I'm not special, that I don't have horns or fangs, that I look like anyone, that I could be anyone. Yes, Detective Chen admitted, that's exactly what keeps me up at night. They sat in silence again. Outside, Detective Chen could hear the sounds of the jail, doors clanging, voices echoing, the mechanical rhythms of incarceration. How long do you have? She asked. Weeks, maybe. The doctor said, it could be any day now. The cancer's in my liver, my lungs, everywhere. They're keeping me comfortable. That's the euphemism they use. Comfortable. As if anything about this could be comfortable. Are you afraid? Thomas considered this, of dying. No, I'm curious about it, actually. Wondering what comes next. If anything comes next. But afraid. No. How can I be afraid of dying when I stopped really living years ago? What about hell? Detective Chen asked. You said you believed in it. I do, Thomas said. But I'm already there. Maybe I'll just be trading one cell for another. One kind of emptiness for another. It can't be worse than what I've been living with. Detective Chen stood up. She didn't know why she'd come, didn't know what she'd hoped to accomplish. Understanding, closure, some sense that this all meant something. I won't come back, she said. I don't think there's anything else to say. No, Thomas agreed. There isn't, but thank you for coming this once. Thank you for listening, for bearing witness, for making sure the world knows what happened to those 9 women. I didn't do it for you, Detective Chen said. I did it for them. I know, Thomas said. That's why it mattered. Detective Chen walked out of the jail and into October sunshine that seemed too bright, too cheerful for what she was feeling. She got in her car and sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine. Her phone buzzed. A text from Captain Morrison. Memorial service for Rachel Denning tomorrow. Family wants you there. Wants to thank you. Detective Chen stared at the message. Wants to thank her. For what? For doing her job. For listening to a confession. For breaking open their grief all over again after 17 years. But she'd go. Of course, she'd go. Because Michael Denning deserved to have people there who'd brought his fiancée home. Because Rachel's parents deserved to bury their daughter. Because even inadequate closure was better than none. She started the car and drove back to the station. There was paperwork to file, reports to write, coordination with other jurisdictions, the administrative aftermath of 9 solved murders. It would take months to sort through, maybe years, and Thomas Calloway would die, probably before any of it was finalized, would die in a cell, alone, empty to the end. And Detective Chen didn't know if that was justice or just the inevitable conclusion to a story that had started years ago when he'd first noticed Claire Hutchison in a restaurant and decided she looked interesting. That night, lying in bed, Detective Chen thought about all 9 women, tried to imagine them, not as victims, but as people. Rachel, who'd wanted to be a therapist. Claire, the waitress who'd been kind. Lisa, who'd begged for her life. Jessica, the passionate environmental advocate. Amanda, the accountant. Melissa, the nurse. Jennifer, the teacher. Both Sarahs, whose names would forever be confused, whose identities would forever be tangled with each other in the public narrative of this case. 9 women who'd had dreams and plans and futures. 9 women who'd been reduced to statistics, to case files, to names on a list of victims. 9 women who'd been seen by Thomas Calloway and marked for death for no reason other than that he'd noticed them. And Detective Chen wondered how many women walked through the world every day not knowing they were being noticed in that way. How many women were being watched, evaluated, selected by people who looked completely normal. How many Thomas Calloways were out there, living ordinary lives, waiting for the moment when they'd act on what they were. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also reality. Because Thomas had been right about one thing. He wasn't special. He wasn't unique. He was just a man who'd made terrible choices and gotten away with it for 17 years. And if he could do it, anyone could. The memorial service for Rachel Denning was held on a Thursday afternoon, exactly 17 years and 7 months after she'd been killed. The church was packed. Family, friends, former classmates, strangers who'd followed the case. Michael Denning sat in the front row, graying now, aged by grief. When he spoke, his voice shook. For 17 years, he said, I didn't know if I should mourn Rachel or keep hoping. I didn't know if I was a widower or still an engaged man waiting for his fiancée to come home. I was trapped in this terrible in-between. And now, finally, I know. Now I can grieve properly. Now I can say goodbye. He paused, wiping his eyes. I don't forgive Thomas Calloway. I'll never forgive him. But I'm grateful he told the truth. I'm grateful Rachel can finally rest. I'm grateful I can finally rest. Detective Chen sat in the back of the church and listened. When the service ended, when people filed out into sunshine that seemed wrong for such an occasion, Michael found her. Thank you, he said simply. I just did my job, Detective Chen said. No, Michael said. You listened. For hours. You listened to that monster describe what he did. You carried that weight so we could have answers. That's more than just a job. That's compassion. Detective Chen didn't feel compassionate. She felt tired, hollowed out, like she'd absorbed some of Thomas Calloway's emptiness by listening to him. Will you be okay? She asked Michael. He considered this. Eventually, maybe. It's going to take time. But at least now I can start. Before, I was frozen. Now I can begin to heal. He walked away, and Detective Chen stood alone in the church parking lot, watching people get into cars and drive away, back to their lives, back to normalcy, back to a world where they didn't have to think about Thomas Calloway or the 9 women he'd killed. But Detective Chen would think about them. She'd think about them for the rest of her career, maybe for the rest of her life, because that's what this job did. It gave you stories you couldn't forget, people you couldn't save, cases that haunted you long after they were closed. 2 weeks later, Thomas Calloway died, peacefully, according to the prison medical staff. In his sleep, no final words, no dramatic last confession, just a quiet slipping away in the middle of the night, as unremarkable as his life had appeared from the outside. Detective Chen read the notification email at her desk, felt nothing, or felt too much, and had learned to shut it down. She wasn't sure anymore. The media covered his death extensively. Debates about whether he'd gotten off easy, whether the justice system had failed, whether his confession meant anything. Experts weighed in on his psychology, his motivations, his pathology. Everyone had an opinion. But Detective Chen didn't care about any of that. She cared about the 9 women. She cared about their families. She cared about making sure their stories weren't forgotten in the rush to analyze and explain and understand the man who'd killed them. She started a file, a personal file, not an official one. In it, she put photographs of the 9 women, not crime scene photos, not autopsy reports, but pictures of them alive, smiling, living, being human. Rachel in her graduation photo, beaming. Claire at a birthday party. Lisa on a beach somewhere, laughing. Jessica at a protest, passionate and alive. Amanda at her desk, professional and confident. Melissa in her nurse's scrubs. Jennifer with her students. Both Sarahs in their own lives, their own moments of joy. 9 women who'd been more than victims, who'd been daughters and sisters and fiancées and friends, who'd had favorite foods and songs they loved, and dreams they'd never get to fulfill. And Detective Chen looked at these photos and made a promise. She'd remember them, not as names on a list, not as cold cases that got solved, but as people, as lives that mattered, as stories that deserved to be told in full, not just the part where they ended, because that's all justice could be sometimes. Not punishment for the guilty, not closure for the grieving, just remembering, just bearing witness, just refusing to let the darkness win completely by forgetting the light that had been extinguished. Outside her office window, the October afternoon faded into evening. The sky turned colors, orange and pink and purple, beautiful and indifferent. The world kept turning. People kept living and dying and loving and losing. And somewhere, 9 families were learning to live with answers that brought no comfort, only finality. And Detective Sarah Chen sat at her desk and looked at 9 photographs and thought about silence. About the 17 years Thomas Calloway had kept his. About the countless other silences that existed in the world, secrets locked inside people who would take them to their graves. About all the unsolved cases that would stay unsolved. About all the families who'd never know. And she thought about the sound a life makes when it ends. Not the violence, not the screaming, not the physical reality of death, but the silence that follows, the absence, the hole left behind that never gets filled, no matter how much time passes. That was Thomas Calloway's legacy. Not 9 murders, but 9 absences, 9 silences, 9 lives that should have continued but didn't. And now, finally, after 17 years, those silences had names again, had stories, had families who could grieve properly, had graves to visit, and stones to lay flowers on. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was something, and in the end, something was all they had. Detective Chen closed the file and went home. Tomorrow, there would be other cases, other victims, other families waiting for answers. The work never ended. The darkness never fully receded. But tonight, she'd remember 9 women who'd lived and loved and dreamed before a man named Thomas Calloway decided they'd die. She'd remember them not for how they died, but for how they lived. And that, perhaps, was the only real victory in any of this. The only light that could exist in so much darkness. The only thing worth holding on to when everything else had been lost. Memory, truth, and the refusal to let silence win.